In this episode, we are going to talk about JSAs, Job Safety Analysis. It's a simple tool, very simple tool, basic tool, but it is so important to what we do in managing safety. And I'm surprised we haven't talked about it yet on the podcast, but in this episode, we will. We'll break down how to approach a JSA and how to complete it. And I've also got a download for you that you can use as well. So let's get into today's topic, covering JSAs.
Welcome to the Safety Pro Podcast, powered by iReportSource, helping you manage safety one episode at a time. With the constant regulatory and workplace culture challenges businesses face, we'll provide you with all the relevant information necessary to achieve a safer, more productive workplace. No management theories, platitudes, or guru speak, just actionable info you can use right away. Now here's your host, the Safety Pro himself, Blaine Hoffman.
All right, after that awesome intro, thanks to Tim Page over at thevoiceoftimpage.com for doing that incredible intro for us. I forget sometimes that it's there, but it's a great one. And of course, we're powered by iReportSource. And I want to thank iReportSource for sponsoring our trip down to New Orleans for the VPPPA National Safety Symposium. Just to recap, VPPPA, the Voluntary Protection Program Participants Association. So companies that are partnering with OSHA in the Voluntary Protection Program, or the VPP, could join this association. I've been involved with VPPPA for many years, as I did VPP work for clients when I was in consulting. So I'm very familiar with the organization. They heard the podcast and thought, hey, let's have them down and have them podcast from our event. It was a great time. Talked to some great folks. I want to thank Wes Carter from Amplify Your Process Safety podcast. I want to thank him for coming out and doing an interview, the first in-person interview that I have done on the podcast. So groundbreaking, Wes. We also talked to some other fine folks, J.A. Rodriguez, Terry Schulte from VPPPA, and we also had Frank King talking about suicide prevention, and we had some podcast listeners. Diana Paredes, she came on and talked about the work she's doing, Leading from the Heart. I encourage you going back and listening to those. But so grateful to have her on, and I'm a huge fan. It was a great experience. And talking with all of the other listeners and colleagues that weren't able to attend throughout the week, I had a great time collaborating on LinkedIn. So go ahead and reach out on LinkedIn and join the conversation. But I talked to a lot of fine folks. And I can't name them all, but, we've got folks, Sam, my friend Sam out in California, talking with him recently as well, who's a listener. I've made so many meaningful connections on LinkedIn. Justin, you guys, I'm not going to name your full names because, I don't want you guys to just get trolled, but you know who you are, right? So Jeremy, Eric, Kyle, Mark, I can't name everybody, but you know who you are. I'm grateful for having you participate in this podcast journey with me. I'm very thankful to have some loyal listeners. Keep communicating with me. Keep reaching out. So enough of that. Let's get into today's episode, right? The topic is JSAs, and I chuckled because, here I'm thinking, oh, yeah, we've talked about JSAs before, haven't we? Well, maybe we've mentioned it, but we didn't dedicate an entire episode to job safety analysis. And I think, that's pretty common. We all know what it is. We've all done them, and it's such a basic tool, but that's the problem. We kind of forget how important it is, how essential it is in identifying, controlling, and communicating potential hazards and safe operating procedures to folks. So we're going to talk about what the JSA is, and we'll go through sort of the textbook definition and methodologies and approach and all that good stuff. So before we get started, there is a download available to you. You got a template available to you that I've put together. Normally, these are standard templates. I developed this one many years ago for several clients. I've used it many times since. It's in portrait mode instead of landscape mode, which to me was a little bit easier. But so look, bottom line, many companies rely on this super simple tool to define appropriate safe work practices for specific jobs. basically all the JSA or job safety analysis process is, and it's also called a job hazard analysis, right? JHA. So it does whatever you call it, JHA, JSA. It's a very effective means of helping to identify and manage hazards that are associated with a task, right, that you have to perform. So in doing so, you can reduce incidents, near misses, things like that, even accidents and injuries in the workplace. It's also an excellent tool to use during new employee orientation or new hire training or even retraining and refresher training. So sometimes I see it being overlooked as a training opportunity or a training aid, right? It can also be used to investigate incidents like near misses and accidents. You can ask quite simply, hey, did we do a JSA for the job they were performing when this incident occurred? If the answer is no, it's a good time to do one. Look and see what you can learn from that incident, but by going through the basic job steps and identifying everything involved. So that's what we're going to get into, all right? So we've got to start at the beginning, of course. So JSA basics. The JSA, it's based on the following ideas. A specific job or work task or assignment can be separated into a series of relatively simple steps. I say relatively because it gets a little subjective, right? B, hazards associated with each step can be identified. And C, solutions can be developed to control each of those hazards. You can see how a template could take shape here. You've got 3 columns. You've got the specific task or job step. You have in the first column. The second column is the hazards associated with each step. And third column, the solutions that can be developed to control each hazard. So to start the process, you've got to pick a job or a task to be performed. And any job that has hazards or potential hazards is a good candidate for this. So an uncommon or even seldom performed job, like a non-routine task, that's also a good candidate because it's something that we may be out of practice on. We don't perform that often, so we're not that familiar with it, and that's a good opportunity to stop and break it down. Now, to start the process, we've got the job, right? You need to document all this. You got a form or a worksheet, okay? Now, I encourage you to download the one that I provided in the show notes, or you go to, if you're listening on, I think it was Pandora, Spotify, links don't work in the show notes. So I apologize. It's not on our end. It's on Spotify's end. So I encourage you to go to thesafetypropodcast.com for this episode, and you'll be able to download the form there. But basically, you're going to need to document this stuff. Now, forms and worksheets, I've seen all sorts, right? They're in, like I said, mine's in portrait mode. There's a landscape mode, which is also very, very popular. But look, at the end of the day, they all do the same thing. Identify the steps, the hazards, and safe work procedures before starting the job. So grab the template for more context. But the process, the JSA process, it's a multi-step process, okay? Let's build this out a little bit more. I mentioned the 3 columns, right? So we're going to start with A, the basic job steps. You have to break the job down into sequential steps, right? Each of the steps should accompany some task that has to be performed. The task will consist of a series of movements. Look at each series of movements within that basic task to identify potential hazards. And there's some tips I'm going to give you on this one too. So again, break the job down into a sequence of steps. And then each step should accompany some major task that has to be performed in support of that job. Okay? The task will consist of a series of movements or actions. Okay? Remember that. Then look at each of those movements, actions, those things you have to do within that basic task. And that gets us to B, potential hazards. Now, to complete a JSA effectively, you have to identify the hazards or potential hazards associated with each step. Every possible source of energy has to be identified. It's important to look at the entire environment in the work area to determine every conceivable hazard that might exist. And hazards contribute to accidents and injuries, which is exactly why we want to identify them. But you also want to look at things like human factors, body position, how many steps somebody has to take to go fetch stuff, to get things. When I said physical environment, maybe just the work area itself, the workbench where you store things. So there's all kinds of stuff that goes into this aspect of identifying all the potential hazards. And C, recommended safe job procedures. So using the sequence of basic job steps and the potential hazards, decide what actions are necessary to eliminate, control, or minimize hazards that could lead to accidents, injuries, or even property damage, or even environmental issues. Each safe job procedure or action must correspond to the job steps and identified hazard, right? It goes front to back, back to front. Okay, so you basically want to address every safety step or safe work procedure has to address a specific hazard or potential hazard you identified in the previous column. Okay, they have to be directly related. What we want to avoid are things like, using air quotes here, be careful, right? Define that. Define what that means. How am I going to observe somebody working, doing this task? Being careful. So you may boil it down by saying, forklift operator must stop and at all intersections, sound the horn, look left, right, left again before proceeding. Must make eye contact with each pedestrian and stop before. That's how I can tell they're being careful, right? So we take being careful, that label, and we flesh it out. We get specific with it. So it has to be measurable or observable. So make sure that you don't forget that piece. Tie each safe job step to a specific hazard. Now, through this process, you can determine the safest, most efficient way of performing, a given job. Now, therefore, I should say, the JSA systematically carries out this basic strategy of accident prevention. That is, and I said it at the beginning, the recognition, evaluation, and control of hazards. So I talked about capturing this on the JSA form. And again, the form is typically a 3-column chart, either portrait or landscape. I've seen both, doesn't matter. Don't get hung up on the format right now, okay? Unless you work for an organization that has controlled documents and approved documents and you're required to use them. I'm thinking government work, if it's a controlled document for quality systems and things like that, then you're going to have to use a specific form. But, aside from that, don't get too hung up on the structure. It's the actual methodology, the approach, and what you're capturing and what you produce at the end. It could be in any type of configuration or format. I've seen, and those of you listening, you've probably seen various versions of a JSA. But basically, every one of them have this thing in common, these 3 columns or 3 areas in common, and that is, going to keep beating this drum, listing the basic job steps on the left-hand column, the corresponding hazards in the middle column, and safe procedures for each step on the right-hand column. And again, each safe procedure, you have to address each hazard listed. So it's very important that you make that relationship. A completed JSA chart can then be used as a training guide for employees, even a training aid at a machine or an operation that they can refer to. I've seen them laminated, hanging at a machine so that a supervisor can walk up and take a look at it and then watch the individual working and go, hey, you're deviating from this step. Why is that? Let's have that conversation. Oh, well, last week when we changed this material, the stock diameter is different and we had to make some, well, then we have to update the JSA, so that gets us into the conversation, right? We want those variables. We want to manage those out of the process, right? Work as expected versus work as conducted. We want to get those as close as possible. They should be the same, essentially. So that's good. It could be used as a job aid. It could be used as a training aid. We certainly want to review these with any new employee or any existing employee that's being reassigned to work with a process or a machine, I should say, or to perform certain tasks, they should be required to review the JSA and go through a couple of dry runs with a senior operator in a controlled environment. I mean, this is a staple of your training process. So a JSA is a very handy tool to be used. Now, let's talk about how to fill out the JSA. We talked about what you put in each column and what you focus on, but I'm going to give you some tips, and it's kind of hard to do on a podcast, right? It's because I don't know what you're looking at. I don't know if you're driving, if you're jogging or at the gym, if you're sitting at your desk. I could even do a video on this as well, but you really just need to get a JSA template and get a few folks involved and actually go walk through a job and break it down into sequential steps and document those steps, and then write down all the potential hazards and go through that assessment. And then you can start working on that final column, which becomes your work practice, right? Your work procedures. So doing this via audio is tricky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some best practices, some tips on how to fill this stuff out, how to write some stuff down, right? There's an art and science to it, right? That's what I'm trying to get at. So let's start with the job steps. Now, there's a happy balance here. We don't want to be too vague, but we also don't want to get into the minutia in too much detail. Otherwise, the JSA will either, one, won't cover everything you need, it'll be ineffective, or two, it'll just be so detailed, so complicated and difficult to follow, folks aren't going to want to use it. So keep that in mind. If they're not detailed enough, you're going to miss important steps and associated hazards. And if it's too detailed, it'll be too cumbersome. So let's give you some examples. Let's say you want to plant a tree, a simple tree, a small tree, and you've got to remove the tree from the truck, right? That's one task you have to do. Get the tree off the truck, off the back of it. It's a pickup truck. It's small. You could pick it up, and it's a small tree, tiny, right? So let's say one example is something that's too detailed, right? You don't want to say, remove latch pin from tailgate in an upright motion. That's step one. Step two, release the tailgate latch with right hand, placing thumb on the top of the latch. I mean, you see what I'm going with here? Step three, lower tailgate to the open position. It's too detailed. You don't need that many details. And there's some exceptions. If removing the latch pin from the tailgate is going to lead to some recognized hazard, like the tailgate's going to just flop down because that's the only thing holding it up, then yeah, you're going to want to say block tailgate before removing latch pin is going to be the safe operating procedure, but you would want that. But for the most part, it's a pickup truck, or it's a work truck, you're just going to lower the tailgate. So let's say you go to planting the tree. Let's say it's by hand. You're going to plant this tree by hand. Step one, retrieve shovel from the back of the truck. Step two, place shovel on ground at specified degree. Step three, place dominant foot onto the back of shovel at the midsole. It's like you're going to lose people with that, right? It's tedious. No one's going to read that document. Instead, it might simply be just enough to say, like I said, open tailgate as the job step, and then identify the hazards associated with opening the tailgate, and then how you want them to do it. Okay? On the flip side, we also don't want to oversimplify it. For example, let's say when we grab the JSA for planting the tree, it says, step one, put tree in ground. That's it. There's no step two. You're done. Job's done. So, all right. So extreme example of oversimplification, but you get the point I'm trying to make, right? Be sure to walk through the job steps and look for opportunities to break it down in sequential order. If you already have job steps laid out, such as in the case of maybe OEM operating instructions or some sort of manual that a machine came with, this makes it a little bit easier because you've got a good starting point. Now, to make sure I illustrate this point clearly, I really drive this home, let's talk about another example. Let's say you need to operate a 3D metal printer. You need to run a print job. You're dealing with metal powder in a laser printer, in a metal printer, 3D printer. You wouldn't just state, Step 1, place build plate inside print chamber. Step 2, close door. Step 3, start print operation. There are obviously more steps, or there's more to this process, which brings me to my next point. Understand the difference between a job or a task and a process. A process is a series of physical, mechanical, even chemical operations, often made up of different jobs or tasks. On the other hand, a job or task is a single activity, either on its own or in support of a larger process, like 3D metal printing. So in this example, there will be the storage, handling, loading of metal powder, right? Media, print media. Then there is the build setup, right? Like installing the build plate, or print setup, I should say. I'm going to get these 3D print experts just pinging me on, vernacular and how the words I'm using. So, hey, that's okay. Go ahead. Let me have it. So the build plate, like installing the build plate, there's even post-print work, right, that you have to cover. Removing the printed part from the build plate. Sometimes, do you have to cut it off? Can it just be snapped off with a hand tool? How do you handle excess powder that's on the build plate? Maybe it's combustible. Maybe it's a flammable solid classification. You can't just take that off and shake it on the ground and blow it off. You can't use, synthetic fiber brush. It has to be natural fiber for static. So look, there's a lot to this project. That's why I call it a process. It's a process, and it's made up of many jobs and tasks that have to be conducted in support of this overall process. And we can break that down. That whole process can be broken down into these individual process parts. Setup, there's cleaning and maintenance, there's the print operation, there's installing the build plate, removing the build plate, there's post-op, work. If we're after, printing this one little part, that's an entire process. We have to break the whole thing down. So you're going to have multiple JSAs. You're not going to have one JSA that says print part, okay? It's or run 3D printer. You're going to have multiple JSAs associated with that 3D printer. So I hope this is kind of clearing some stuff up for you. So a good tip, as you complete your JSA, make sure each job or task step starts with an action. Use a verb, an actual verb, like pull lever, push door, place ladder, etc. Those are just examples, but the steps that don't present a potential hazard can be left off. Now, there's an exception to this, which I like this exception. That is, most safety folks, those of us that are schooled in JSAs and went to safety school and we learned how to do this JSA would leave a lot of stuff off because it doesn't really pose a safety hazard. For example, checking, settings on a machine while it's running, monitoring a machine. Those are all great for quality, longevity of the machine. They impact the quality of the part, the finished product, and they're very, very necessary. They're required parts of the job. But they don't pose a hazard. You stand there, you look at a gauge, you have to make sure this thing's reading this. There are cases where something like that could pose a hazard, but in large part, you're going to leave a lot of that stuff off of JSA. So what you can do, if you wanted to, which I've seen and I like, is if you're going to use this as a multi-purpose job aid covering other job steps, such as those for quality and production, right? So this layered approach might work well for you. And the reason is, the feedback I got, from folks on the floor, boots on the ground, is that they see workers, they see that there is one way to perform that job, right? They don't see different work instructions that look different format, different form, and then they see this laminated JSA hanging there, and it leaves a lot of the other stuff off. They use the work instructions that are up on a monitor for most of their builds. Why not incorporate safety language, safety steps into that document and not create another one that's going to hang there that they're probably not going to reference, right? It's not about whether or not they should or shouldn't or right or wrong. It's just human. I would. If that was my job, was to print this part or machine this part or whatever. And I'm looking at the work instructions on the monitor, or I'm required to have that work instruction there, face up, front and center on the top of the stack for the part I'm building or milling. And I'm looking at that to make sure I'm doing it properly. Put the safety steps into that, like do this layered approach, right? So that's another tip for you that would work. Now, whether you have existing jobs that need to be reviewed or you're implementing a new job or task, employee involvement is critical. So that brings me to this tip. Be sure to do I mentioned it earlier, several walkthroughs of the process with operators before publishing the document. Make sure you didn't miss anything. They're the ones doing the job, and it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? It's, I've heard people say, look, our operators, they create all the job instructions because they're the pros. And it's like, well, sort of. There's value to an objective observer as well, an outside observer who doesn't know anything about it, because it forces you to ask, hey, I've never done this before. Let's start at the beginning. Walk me through it like I'm a 5-year-old. And it forces seasoned operators to stop and break down what they do off of muscle memory, almost like non-thinking tasks, right? Going through the motions. They just know this so well, they just do it. It forces them to stop and reevaluate what it is, not just what it is they do, how they do what it is that they do, step by step. So collaborate. It takes a team of diverse people to do this, a safety person, an engineer, a maintenance manager, a materials manager, a quality manager. Yes, operators from other shifts, operators from other departments. Get a good cross-section of the organization, that diagonal cross-section of the organization, so that everybody can contribute. You would be shocked at the progress that can be made with that kind of input. So the JSA should also be reviewed, approved, and signed by a supervisor before that task is started. Understanding every job step is critical when we roll something like this out. Make sure that, whenever a job step changes or a new step is introduced, that JSA, that work instruction, if you're using a layered approach, and that's another benefit of a layered approach is, more often than not, folks are going to update the work instruction, and they'll forget that the JSA has to be updated as well. Or nobody gets with the safety person because we changed something about the build process. We modified the machine. We eliminated the step. We changed the setup and eliminated some steps. So leaned it out. So lean manufacturing, all this lean stuff that's coming, which is great. Go back to half a dozen episodes where I'm just carrying the lean banner, right? Where we should be approaching safety the same way with this lean mindset. But with lean lean manufacturing on the production side achieves the same efficiencies. However, safety needs to be involved, because when we change the setup, we can be eliminating entire steps in the process, eliminating hazards. We may not need some protective measures that we've invested in that we now have to check annually and get certified or have a vendor come in to do. We may be able to see other efficiencies outside of productivity, direct productivity of, making that part or running that machine. On the flip side, we may be introducing some new issues that we hadn't considered before. So always review each job step when making changes to the job with the operators. Always look at the JSA, whether separate or a layered form, when you make those changes, okay? And please, please, please don't forget, the key reasons for completing a JSA are to encourage, of course, teamwork, which I just talked about, especially with new employees. Great way to get them familiarized with the job is to walk through a JSA. But to involve everyone performing the job in the process, to increase awareness of potential hazards, and to communicate safe operating procedures, okay? That is the biggest reasons, those are the biggest reasons for completing the JSA. Now remember, I have a JSA template to download, okay? Be sure to practice this a few times, review it with others, get some folks involved, make sure you get the hang of it. Make sure you don't overlook a job, step, or task that introduces a hazard. I mean, this is the whole point of the exercise: identify and control hazards associated with performing a job and setting up safe operating procedures. So always go through and make sure you didn't miss any job steps. All right. So I wanted to cover JSAs. I tried to boil it down as simply as I could without actually being, in person with you one-on-one going through one. But in this audio medium that we have, I wanted to kind of say, all right, let's define the spirit and purpose of a JSA, what its intended goals are for completing a JSA. We talked a little bit about the tool itself, the form, making sure that we use the same methodology no matter what the form or template looks like. Portrait, landscape, grids, just lines with check boxes and free form sort of fill out type of boxes. But look, the end result is we're breaking down a job into sequential steps, identifying the hazards of each step, and associating a safe operating procedure or defining how we mitigate each identified hazard, right, for each job step. So we went forward and we went backwards. And then, of course, you want to socialize this. You want to share this with others, with what we would call affected employees, those doing the job or facing the hazards. And it's always good to have it at the job site where the tasks are likely to be performed in a binder, digitally at a workstation where folks can pull it up. But also for folks like myself, a safety person, a quality person, the VP of manufacturing should be able to walk up to a machine and just grab the laminate hanging on the side of the machine and looking at the lockout tagout procedure or reviewing the setup procedure and watch the operator to see, oh, yeah, we're doing all the things that have been outlined in there. And those are outlined in such a way to prevent access or exposure to hazards that we recognize, which will lead to injuries and accidents. So that's the whole spirit. That's the whole purpose of the JSA, a handy tool, a staple, if you will, which is why we commonly overlook it. I mean, we don't overlook it. We live by it every day, but it's like what I said earlier. It's almost muscle memory, a non-thinking task. We're always breaking jobs down into steps and identifying all the hazards and then coming up with safe work procedures. So going through this exercise, even if it's a matter of exercise, that's good for us. We know what exercise does for us. Maybe get a little sore, but we're better off for it, right? So keep that in mind. Let me know what you think. Shoot me an email. The email link is in the show notes. Also, I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn so we can continue to collaborate on workplace safety. Post a comment on LinkedIn about this episode as well if you have some thoughts. Be sure to @mention Blaine J. Hoffman, 2 F's, 2 N's. Just look for me on LinkedIn. Or the Safety Pro Podcast LinkedIn page. We have a page there as well. You can also find the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, wherever you hang out. We probably have a presence. So let me know what you think. And until the next Safety Pro Podcast episode, as always, be safe.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Safety Pro Podcast, powered by iReportSource, the all-in-one digital safety solution. For info on how you can request a free demo on all the capabilities of iReportSource to streamline your business's safety management system, head over to thesafetypropodcast.com. We look forward to helping you manage safety on the next episode of the Safety Pro Podcast.